Crash Bandicoot is one of those games that everyone seems to love. Whenever this game is talked about, it's only ever done so with delight. People really like this game, and I think for good reason. It was a commercial and critical success and was the foundation for many great games to follow, and for many of us, it was a huge part of our childhoods. I'm sure we all have fond memories of our first magical experiences with this game, even if they might be tainted and exaggerated by nostalgia. Crash Bandicoot is a beloved game no matter which way you look at it, and I feel like it deserves the respect it gets. But one thing I've always thought is that the reasons why we all love this game so much are peripheral. They're more to do with the way that we as people connected with the game, and not actually about the game itself. It's all well and good saying that we have great childhood memories with the game, but that doesn't mean that the game itself is necessarily good. The game may have sold millions and millions of copies and birthed a series that continues to succeed to this very day, which would imply that the game is good, but that's not necessarily true either. The same applies with how the game was reviewed. If a game critic says the game is great, then, good for them. But their word isn't law. What the critic says is all subjective and can't really be used as indisputable evidence of the game's quality. I learned that the hard way with Super Mario 64. Now, I'm not saying that everyone is wrong to like Crash Bandicoot, and I'm certainly not calling the game bad. I'm merely suggesting that maybe our opinions are being influenced by external factors that the game itself isn't responsible for. And that got me wondering, if I were to remove those external factors, if I were to forget those childhood memories, forget how well it performed critically and commercially, and forget every other Crash Bandicoot game that came after it, would this game still hold up as one of the all-time greats? Would it truly be as good as we all seem to think? I wanted to look at this game as a singular entity from a completely new angle, one separated completely from those external factors, and see what I would think. Is Crash Bandicoot as good as we seem to believe, or does it fall short of its reputation? That's what I'm going to find out. I'm going to start by talking about the story, and I'm going to talk about the story in the same way the game tells it, by bringing it up briefly at the beginning and forgetting about it right until the very end. The plot in Crash Bandicoot is actually really cool. The evil Dr. Neo Cortex is planning to take over the world by creating an army of mutant animals intended to be led by a general, Crash Bandicoot. But when Cortex's plan fails, Crash Bandicoot escapes and washes up on Insanity Beach. Knowing that his girlfriend, Torna, is still in danger, Crash traverses the various islands in the Wampa Archipelago to rescue her, taking down Cortex's minions and foiling his world domination scheme as he does so. While at the end of the day it is a damsel in distress story, it is made much more involved by Cortex's plan and motivations. It's a plot with multiple layers, which makes it more interesting. The only problem is that the plot doesn't actually progress throughout the game. You have the opening, which sets up the plot, and the ending, which brings the plot to a close, but there's nothing in between. This game's story is kind of like a nothing sandwich. Two perfectly good slices of bread at either end, with absolutely no filling whatsoever. I get that this is a video game and that the gameplay is the main focus, but it would still be nice to have the story develop in some way. With a few extra cutscenes here and there, we could get to know the characters and setting a bit better and get more invested in what's going on. We could turn that nothing sandwich into the best ham and cheese you've ever eaten. But that didn't happen, unfortunately. What we're left with is still fine, it's just a bit shallow. I'm not asking for a novel here, I just wish there was a little more depth to the plot. It feels very much like a once upon a time, the end type of situation. But what's really important here is the gameplay. As you'd expect, the gameplay makes up the majority of the game, so it's gotta be good for the experience to be an enjoyable one. The core gameplay of Crash Bandicoot is very simple and straightforward. You play as Crash, and you traverse through 3D linear levels by running, jumping, and spinning. And that's sort of it. Crash controls pretty well, aside from his slightly stiff and clunky movement, and the levels are built perfectly with his abilities in mind. Not that that's hard to do, he can only do two things. Like I said, simple and straightforward. Of course there are more layers to it than that. For example, every level is littered with crates to break, each with different effects. Some give you lives, some give you Wampa Fruit to help you earn lives, some give you an Aku Aku mask for protection, some are checkpoints, some just explode, and they're all over the place. The crates are actually pretty vital to keeping the gameplay interesting. If you removed all the crates from the game, you'd be running through mostly empty hallways, and you'd only be jumping and spinning every so often. The crates do an excellent job of filling the void between hazards and give you something to do as you're completing levels. Breaking them also rewards you with a gem, so long as you break them all on a level without dying, and collecting all the gems unlocks a secret ending, so not only does it make the level less boring, but it also gives you a secondary goal to work towards. Without them, I'd say the gameplay would be pretty boring. It'd be like playing tennis without an opponent. There'd be no substance to it, and it just wouldn't be as fun. The core gameplay is solid and enjoyable, and it can get pretty challenging towards the end of the game, but at times it does feel lacking. The gameplay in Crash Bandicoot is primitive. Not in the sense that it's the type of gameplay that archaeologists would dig up and study like it's an artifact, but more in the sense that the gameplay is very basic. The more you play the game, the more you realize that it doesn't really evolve all that much. There are some gimmick levels that add an extra layer to it, like the boulder chases, hog rides, and darkness levels, but that's the most involved it ever gets. You don't earn any new abilities, you aren't introduced to any new types of crates or level elements, nothing really changes. You just have different arrangements of very similar crates, pits, and enemies. It's like when you rearrange your bedroom. You're not adding in any new furniture or decoration, you're just sort of moving it all around. Same stuff, configured differently. So while the gameplay is generally pretty good, it's also stagnant, and doesn't actually get any better the longer you play the game. But the game does make up for that in difficulty. The game does get a lot harder as you keep playing, and it keeps you on your toes, which in a way makes up for what would otherwise be repetitive gameplay. But at the end of the day, despite its basic and unchanging nature, the gameplay is really good in this game and is honestly the main appeal. But it's not the only appeal the game has. Crash Bandicoot looks amazing, especially when compared to some of the crap that came out around the same time. Super Mario 64, Bubsy 3D, fucking disgusting. I would rather rip my eyes out and blend them into a smoothie than point them in the general direction of those abominations. But Crash Bandicoot? What a beauty. Definitely deserves a permanent place in the wank bank. Where other games from this era are overly polygonal, lacking detail, and ooze the same amount of charm as an actual turd, Crash Bandicoot ends up being the mid-90s video game equivalent of a supermodel. The environments are all rich, vibrant, and full of detail, and they're pleasant to look at, as are the characters. On top of that, the music is fantastic too. Every song is catchy and/or atmospheric, and perfectly matches its setting. I know that if this game were to come out today, nearly 3 decades later, it probably wouldn't be as impressive, but for 1996, this game is quite a looker. So far, I've been mostly positive about this game. I've praised the gameplay, the story, and the presentation, so you'd think the answer to my initial question is yes, Crash Bandicoot is as good as it seems. But the reality is, it sort of isn't. Because despite the many things that the game gets right, there are a handful of things the game also gets wrong. They're not colossal things that ruin the whole experience, it's not like the game has a feature where the disc flies out of the PlayStation and slices your hands off. It just has a few things about it that are just plain stupid. Like, for instance, the save system. The save system in this game is fucking ridiculous. There are 2 ways to save your progress. You can either A, complete one of Torna's bonus rounds, or B, collect a level's gem by breaking all the crates. Now in isolation, that doesn't sound too bad, but the reality is stupider than that. Firstly, you only get 1 attempt at a Torna bonus round, so if you fail it, you don't get to save. Secondly, you can only get a gem if you break all the crates in a level without dying, and most of the time you can't even get all the crates anyway because you need color gems from other levels, which also require you to break all the crates in those levels without dying, so it's not very often you'll get to save this way. What makes this worse is that the punishment for getting a game over is that your progress is set back to the last time you saved. So if you're really shit at the game, you might never get to save, so every time you get a game over, you're sent back to the beginning. That's awful. Is it really that hard to let the player save their progress at will? I don't see the point in designing it like this. It's honestly ridiculous. Speaking of bonus rounds, there are 3 types. You have Torna bonus rounds that allow you to save your progress, there are Cortex bonus rounds which provide keys to unlock secret levels, and there are Embryo bonus rounds which do nothing. They do absolutely nothing. I don't understand what the point of Embryo bonus rounds are. You don't get anything for beating them, which is dumb because they're really hard. You think you'd get some sort of reward for beating such a difficult challenge, but you don't get anything. It's a total waste of time. I personally think they should have put the color gems in these bonus rounds as rewards, just to at least give them purpose, and also to make collecting color gems less of a pain in the arse. And then you have boss fights. The boss fights in this game are pretty shocking. They're really easy, and they're usually over within seconds. The bosses themselves are cool as characters, but they aren't much of a threat. Even when armed with explosives and guns and potions and lasers, they struggle to actually hit you. So yeah, they're very underwhelming. With all that in mind, it's time to answer the big question. Is Crash Bandicoot as good as it seems? No, it's not. Don't get me wrong, the game is great, the gameplay is fun and focused, the environments and characters look and sound fantastic, and the story, despite lacking substance, is really cool. But the experience is dragged down a bit by a handful of things. The gameplay is simple, but it's too simple. It's held back by its own simplicity. It causes the game to feel a little bit repetitive, since it doesn't actually evolve in any way besides difficulty. Then you have the pathetic boss fights, ridiculous save system, and unnecessary bonus rounds. Things that just make you say, why? Why is the game like this? I'm not saying the game is bad in any way, of course it isn't. It's just lacking in a few areas that prevent the whole experience from being as good as it could be. So, no, Crash Bandicoot is not as good as it seems. But despite that, the things the game gets right are done really well. And if you bring back those external factors I mentioned at the beginning, it's impossible to deny that Crash Bandicoot totally deserves the respect it gets, and is without a doubt an all-time classic. So I guess the overall message is, yeah, Crash Bandicoot is pretty good, but, pipe down.